Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. We'd love for you to check us out if you haven't already. Northwood is a church that welcomes and accepts all persons. It's something we want to hold out front and center. I'm proud to serve a denomination called the Disciples of Christ. Look them up. That recognizes the callings and the ordinations of those who have often been left out or outright persecuted against, much less given leadership positions within the church. I'm thinking here of women and queer people broadly, and there have been others throughout history. But as I was saying, I'm very proud to name several women and queer people and even several queer women as my colleagues in ministry. And if a movement toward reconciliation and inclusion sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, you might check us out. To learn more, please visit our church's website, Northwood's website. It's www.indYNCC.org. That's indncc.org. Or if you're simply content with the podcast, I encourage you to like, subscribe, or follow the Northwood Podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen. If you haven't done so, pause right now and do that. That way you'll know when new episodes are up. And also it will aggregate more people to our podcast. So it's a way of spreading the word. And I encourage you to do that. While we're on the topic of podcasts, I'm happy to let you know that ours is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. The All Indiana Podcast Network produces and distributes podcast content created by Indiana residents of various kinds and persuasions, and often about topics of interest to we Hoosiers, though not exclusively. Either way, you should check out their other offerings. You may do so by visiting www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. And shifting gears, we're about to move on to the main topics for today, but first we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience that we were just talking about. And if this means you, we'll catch you after these ads. And we're back. The leaping off point for today's message is a passage from the Bible found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Mark 6, 1 through 13. Here, Jesus has been on a tear, healing across the land, and now he has arrived back at his hometown, where he grew up. And here's where the story picks up, and I'll just read it. Mark 6, verses 1 through 13. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals, and not to put on 2 tunics. Just bring one. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that place. If any place will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. That's where the passage leaves off, those disciples doing the things that Jesus had done. Before we really dive in, though, I'd like to talk about this word prophet that came up a few times, as in Prophet, one who would prophesy, or a seer, someone who is wise. You may have noticed that the word pops up often in our common vernacular to mean somebody who sees into the future. And I just like to clear up some confusion about this word, because in recent times, this word has come to be used to describe someone who can see into the future and then make predictions about what's going to happen. And this is very unfortunate, because in the biblical world, this is seldom what the word actually means. In the Bible, a prophet almost always means someone who can accurately and sagely, perhaps like a frantic maniac, but with clarity, describe their current circumstance. An inspired teacher or preacher who could proclaim the will of God to a people in a specific time. So, the prophet would look at a cultural landscape and proclaim it unjust, or greedy, or violent, and then describe what sort of transformation needed to occur for that culture to conform to life-giving ways. This will be the sense in which we talk about a prophet throughout this time together. Just so you know, when I say prophet, that's what I mean. One who truthfully and in wisdom calls it like it is, and then describes things as they ought to be. Keep that in mind as we proceed. And I have preached on this passage before, or at least one of its parallel versions in one of the other synoptic gospels. I think it's in Matthew and Luke as well. I know it's in Luke. I should have looked that up before I started this, but neither here nor there. But let me tell you, I have enjoyed preaching on this story. A sermon about leaving behind those things, or better yet, those people who have irked me in life. I mean, have you ever slammed a door in a moment when you knew in your very bones that it was justified? It felt so good, right? Like scratching poison ivy. Never did it occur to me to question who the prophet was in my scenarios when I'd hear passages like this read or talked about. And then later, being a pastor, I was used to people taking issue with something or other about me. So I could see myself in this way too easily. I can remember, for instance, coming back to my childhood church after my first year away at college. I was even then training to be a pastor, and I thought I had learned a thing or two. I probably had. But I was arrogant, and I had even arranged to return home as a student minister whose role was to lead the youth and assist the pastor. I was even tasked with teaching an adult Sunday school class, like teaching some of the people who had raised me. Kind of ridiculous. I thought I'd wow them with my newfound knowledge, and I thought I'd challenge them and correct their folksy, colloquial, quaint understanding of the scriptures and church history. In short, I was an arrogant young fool and was received as such. But do you know what I called it then, when they questioned me or rolled their eyes? Persecution. I was a prophet without honor in my own town, my home. It was cathartic to metaphorically wipe the dust off my shoes and return to college for my sophomore year. And this Messiah complex never leaves us overnight. In my first years of pastoring, now a college graduate with a degree in Christian ministries, I thought I was about to reinvent the local church. I had ideas, I had passion, I had an axe to grind, I had answers to life's problems, and I hadn't even really lived. And rest assured, I let everyone know about it. I preached impassioned sermons calculated to convict and move hearts. I preached as one who knew that he had seen the face of God and was tasked with describing what I'd seen to a group of people who couldn't possibly understand. When I was met with criticism of my style or my half-cooked ideas, or resistance to my ideas, in fact, I would say persecution. Again, a prophet without honor in my new hometown. This was, I explained to myself, why nothing I tried seemed to work. After all, Jesus could, quoting verse 5, perform no deed of power, except heal a few sick people. And it was because Jesus was hamstrung by the lack of faith in his hometown, so why not me? So I lamented the lack of faith I saw in others, and in doing so, I felt better myself, insecure as I was. Shake the dust off your feet and move on, right? Well, it could be true for people like me in those times. It could be necessary. But lately, the conversations I've been having have caused me to rethink what this passage could mean for the church in this year, 2024. But let's go back to it, and I'll tell you why. Jesus had been traveling and healing. We've been over that. He arrives at his hometown where he was, as I said, hamstrung by their lack of belief in his capacity to heal. So he moves on and now sends out his disciples to do similar work. It is in this context that he instructs them to, should they be received with less than a warm welcome, shake the dust off of their feet as they leave. The text says that this serves as a testimony against them being whoever were rude, I guess, or overtly hostile. It's a powerful gesture and image, leaving behind, metaphorically or literally, the very dirt they tarnished you with. It's as if to suggest, I'm leaving, but I'm taking none of your ugliness with me. Growing up, I took this advice to be good advice for those who may get their feelings hurt. But also, I took this to be the model of how to react should someone reject me for my faith. Again, this persecution complex is kicking in at this stage in my life I'm here describing. While it is true that in places on this planet someone may be persecuted for following Jesus, this could hardly be said where I was living growing up and where I still live. In fact, upon further reflection, I think that the inverse has been true. Could it be that others have been leaving the church, shaking the metaphorical dust, the hurt, the trauma off their feet, that our churches that we Christians have all too often generated, and that it is we who are now all covered in the dust? Just flip it. We always see ourselves in the role of the persecuted leaving in a huff, but could it be that the church has been persecuting our prophets for over the course of centuries? For me, these are rhetorical questions, all of these. There are broad strokes I should paint with first to make the point. Greed, for example, has always been the church's bugaboo. We've been all too corrupted by the allures of wealth, forgetting that the church is meant to be but a conduit for wealth, so that it may flow to the places where it is most needed. I'm thinking here of hungry bellies, shelter for those who need it, and every other human need met first before we bask in the overflow of what God has trusted us with. We've done this very poorly. We've built up our institutions as if they were the point, the reason for their own existence, as if they justified their own existence. When really, our churches are meant to be places where even the institution's impulse is to die, if this means the people might then live. But over the course of centuries, people have noticed our churches and its leaders treating money and wealth generally as if it were the point of it all after all. That is what the dominant message of the last century, I think, has been. Church leaders have then lived conforming to that culture. They've lived ostentatiously, even as they encouraged the poor to have more faith. In our century, the rise of the prosperity gospel has soured our reputation still more, as it suggests that getting rich is evidence of God's approval, and even perhaps the overall reason that one might follow Jesus in the first place. Strange idea to follow a poor man to get rich. People are supposed to be able to turn to Christian communities driven by the principles of Jesus, and then find relief from the evil impacts of greed. Instead, they find that things are much the same inside of many churches. They can feel like shopping malls as well as any other place in the United States. And we often fail too, don't we, to speak prophetically about the dangers of wealth, consumerism, and idolizing profit margins over prophetic words of those who'd question the wisdom of all of this. So after observing this, they shake the dust off of our ideas and our examples and off their feet, leaving us all covered in their dust. And we think as them. Now that's broad strokes, what I've just described. How about the specifics? Well, we've had prophetic movements rise out of our churches. But have we always listened to these voices? For centuries in Europe and in North America, social pariahs called abolitionists called for the end of slavery, and many did so on Christian principles. They drew from their faith the idea that all humans are God's children and made in God's image. Now, being as though nearly everyone involved in these discussions, save most of the slaves, were Christians, you'd think that they'd quickly arrive at the right conclusions. In fact, one should wonder how allegedly Christian nations, states, or slavers could ever have cultivated such practices in the first place. But the reverse was true. Slavery was not only left largely unchallenged by Christian convictions by and large, but excuses for it were instead bolstered by Christian slaveholders and slave transporters who told lies and invented for themselves a tiered religion where God favored white peoples over all the others. But alas, the slaves had some Bibles. Now, they weren't allowed to read for a reason. For they may learn to read, and then they might read in their Bibles of the Exodus narrative, for example, where other enslaved people were freed by God en masse from an empire. Or they might read some of Paul's epistles, letters to early Christian communities, where he wrote of how in Christian communities it should be that all ethnic, class, and gender identities, categories that often divide us, will instead matter less than our loving relationships and common belief in the gospel of Jesus and to the love to which it calls us. What a compelling image for a community, in my opinion. If only Christians could once, and in a sustained way, live into it. Instead, we've all too often served the cause of oppressors, or perhaps simply failed to engage in struggles we ought to have dove into. The frustration, for example, of civil rights leaders with moderate white Christians is well documented, and many left the church for other liberation movements, and who could blame them? They shook off the dust of our timidity and our cowardice, and they left us behind. It was the church that was left most covered in dust during these years, at least by my estimation. In recent decades, gay people have been asking for a place in the church. Actually, probably throughout time, they have been hidden and wanting a place. We now know this. A place on equal footing with so-called straight people. I think the call to include and affirm queer people is a prophetic one. I think it's the natural conclusion to a gospel that calls us toward greater and greater loves and more radical forms of inclusion. So gay Christians started speaking up even as broader cultural movements were taking off, calling our society toward a greater love and acceptance. And queer and prophetic voices, not welcomed in their home communities, leading the way. And how many have left the church in recent decades over this issue of human sexuality because, well, so many queer people have fallen out of the church and have been forced out, more accurately, and have been left shaking off the dust of our fear and sometimes hatred, leaving us all covered in dust, as I keep saying, our vision very cloudy. And those who have family members, loved ones, children who are gay, transgender, what have you, these see how challenged followers of Jesus have failed to love. Challenged followers, or I say alleged followers, it's challenging, but if we are followers, we will do it. We have failed to love queer friends. And in my opinion, they have left us all covered in dust, and rightfully so. During the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, as some evangelical Christians stoked fear and hatred towards the gay community, we followers of Jesus could have been louder. We could have been braver. We could have come out of our own closets and stood up against the tide of animosity the gay community continues to face even today, as it is again amping up. And now, the sands of time, well, you know how time goes. But the problems that plague humanity do not seem to abate. They change, but they continue. But we've still prophetic voices all around us, calling us away from greed, away from fear, away from hatreds, and towards generosity, courage, and love. There are prophetic voices calling for the end of war, and those who do not realize that they are all covered in dust, calling those around us our misguided guides, helping them to see that they are covered in dust. There are prophetic voices calling for us to consider better economic ends that value human thriving and well-being over the profit motive. And here I mean profit. There are prophetic voices calling us away from all forms of bigotry and fear over God's children, our brothers and sisters in the world, from whom we now feel separate from. But we are hoping, we are called to hope, pine for communion. We hope to come to know them. That's what the gospel calls us to. And here the prophetic voices calling us away from old ways and into something radically new, I hope will catch our attention. And the church, well, we may be all covered in dust, but it's not too late. Jesus is always calling us away from sin and into life. Here is a moment where we can each, in our own ways, shake off the dust we've long too ignored. We can shake off what keeps us from loving radically or what keeps us bound to our material possessions, idols, making them gods. But we must hear and notice first the truth-telling voices of our times. So what prophets have been placed near you? Voices speaking truth and wisdom you have heretofore missed? A voice willing to name the uncomfortable truths of our times near and around you? Perhaps in the form of a child or an activist, an advocate for the poor. They take all forms and shapes and sizes, these who can name the truth. Their faces and shapes are numerous. If we are wise, we'll open our eyes and see them and open our ears to listen to the prophets in our midst. Then we too may shake off the dust that clouds our vision and follow Jesus into danger, into safety, or to wherever he may lead.